Well, this is it. We are excited about ending the semester here in Old Testament biblical law, and looking forward to being able to be with you on Thursday and take care of this final exam. This is the review video for it, and as I try to mention in all the videos, this is a good hodgepodge of what you might see on the test. I'm not promising that I've covered everything on the test, but I think for the most part, I will try to cover everything on the test, and probably if I don't mention it, it's very likely not on the test, although I'm not promising that. First things first, I want to go over what you're going to see on the test. The very first page is a completion section, and of course that would be just answering whatever the question would entail. The second page is a matching section. And basically what you're going to have is any of our important commandments and the 10 commandments on here. So think about the Shema, the royal law, the first civil ordinance, the golden rule, commandments 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 10. A big old matching section, matching, different ones to what they are. And so you might think about each one of those categories and what they entail. Then there is a multiple choice section where you will have 3 choices and you'll be able to pick what the right answer is. So I think that will be a relatively easy section. There is a page full of 4 essays. Now I'll give you some ideas. Obviously these are things that we've covered before. Think about some of the different essays that we've dealt with. We dealt with an essay that dealt with Jephthah and his decision. We dealt with an essay that dealt with the Canaanites, the extermination of the Canaanites, and why God, why that was okay, and why they did that. We dealt with an essay that dealt with Solomon's chariot stalls and that supposed Bible contradiction. We dealt with an essay that dealt with wine, and specifically about Proverbs 31, 5 and 6, that deals with, when is wine given. And we talked about that. Does it mean that, you give wine to somebody who's depressed or whatever. We talked about that. We talked about the rich young ruler and the idea of obeying the commandments in order to get to heaven. Why did Jesus tell him when the rich young ruler asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he says, keep the commandments. Why did Jesus do that? We talked about essays that dealt with, let's see here, Seventh-day Adventists and their belief that the Sabbath is on Saturday. And we spent some essays that dealt with that. Let's see here. We dealt with essays. I think there's one more that I was thinking off the top of my head, and hopefully it's not on here. But anyway, so just think about the different essays that we've dealt with, and you might just even think through some of the things on the syllabus that we talked about. Lawful wealth and ways that the government sometimes legally allows for theft. And so several different essays that we covered, and there will be 4 of them on this test. Then there will be a final completion section, once again filling in the blank of the answer, and then there's some bonus questions that'll give you some extra points that might be helpful. And so you can actually get over 100% on this test. All right, there are 50 total questions plus a couple of bonuses, and so once again, that is kind of what we're looking for as far as the test. Now, let's cover some of the concepts that you will see on the test, and hopefully this will be a big help to you. Of course, we talked about right off the bat why we study biblical law, and we mentioned that biblical law is an important thing to study in that it helps us to see how God thinks about things, and that's really important. In this world today, we establish a lot of things on moral relativism. And of course, that is very wishy-washy. We want to establish things on God's law, on God's way of thinking. And that's so important. We talk about the fact that there are some things in biblical law that are no longer in effect today. For instance, blood sacrifices, earthly priesthood, the temple, the dietary laws. And so you want to know different things that aren't maybe applicable today. We talk about the term antinomianism, which basically means it's the belief that a Christian does not have to follow the law anymore, that he's freed from the law by grace, from obeying the law. And of course, we talk about the fact that we don't believe in that. We believe that a Christian should follow the law of God. Thou shalt not kill still is applicable today. And only the things that the Bible tells us specifically are no longer applicable, like dietary law, blood sacrifices, such forth. Those things don't have to be obeyed. It is true that we're not under the curse of the law, but God's law is still God's law. We mentioned the Jewish Talmud, which is their civil and canonical law, all put down, and of course that's an important term to know. We mentioned, and I've already talked about the fact that this is on the test, the Shema, which is the most important of, you might say, the Jewish laws in the Old Testament. And that is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, all thy might. And that is known as the greatest commandment. Even Jesus said that. They ask him, what is this greatest commandment? And he says, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and might. All right. Then there's the royal law. And that's really the second greatest commandment. He said the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And of course, the book of James calls that the royal law. We also mentioned the golden rule that Jesus gave, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. All right. And of course, that's a very important rule. Then we have the first civil ordinance, which is the death penalty on capital offenses. We also mentioned the fact that there are 18 reasons why a person could get the death penalty in Old Testament biblical law. We mentioned the Shema specifically has something else special in it, and that is the use of the word one. In Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And we mentioned that Hebrew word akkad is a collective one. It means many in one, all right? Kind of like a bushel of apples, all right? Many, but they're one. And, of course, that deals with the Trinity of Unity, very important thing. We also mentioned that in the Shema, there are 3 ways that a person should love God. You should love him with all thy heart, all thy soul, and all thy might. And those are the 3 ways we're to love God. We also mentioned that there is one way to show God that you love him. And of course, the Bible tells us that is by following his commandments, which is one of the other reasons why we don't believe in antinomianism. You can't really show God that you love him if you don't follow his commandments, all right? We mentioned the fact that although the commandment, thou shalt have no other God before me, is a command in the Bible, we mentioned that under biblical law, God did not call for the killing of people just because they don't believe in it. Now, God did give capital punishment for people who tried to seduce other people into their religion or tried to convert people from the truth. But just not believing in God did not give you the death penalty. Israel did not go after the Edomites. They did not go after the Ammonites, even though they didn't believe in God. They did go after the Canaanites, and of course we discussed that. Israel was operating as God's executioner in a sense, and they had a lot of diseases that would have been passed on if they wouldn't have been wiped out. We mentioned the second commandment, and of course that deals with man coming to God on God's terms, and we mentioned especially dealing with the worship that the Old Testament altar was very simple. It was a pile of rocks, a pile of dirt. It was a very simple altar. We talked about the fact that true worship and religion is simple. It's not sculpted. It doesn't require helps. True religion doesn't require helps. We also talked about the negativism of the law, and we mentioned that the law was written in a negative way for several different reasons. Of course, first of all, a positive law would have filled volumes of books of all the things that we're allowed to do. But we also mentioned the fact that a negative law deals particularly with evil. It makes it very plain. It also limits the government, all right? This is what you cannot do, but everything else you can do. And so it doesn't allow the government to control man completely. It just allows the government to control evil and stop evil, which is the business of the government. We mentioned under the third commandment that oaths were not to be made for private purposes, and that all Christian speech is technically under oath, and that's why you just don't make oaths randomly. All right, they are for specific purposes. We also talked about the fact that Christians sometimes are guilty of taking the name of the Lord God in vain. Sometimes they will use that phrase OMG. And of course, that is definitely taking the name of God in vain. We also mentioned the fact that sometimes in prayer, people will use God's name as and just continually repeat the word Lord or the word God. And that is really taking the name of God in vain. And of course, we don't want to do that. We mentioned the fourth commandment, the Sabbath. And of course, we mentioned the idea of weekly worship was not really involved in the idea of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is rest, a day of rest. And they did worship on the Sabbath day. They worship on every other day as well. And we mentioned the fact that the weekly worship wasn't really instituted until the synagogue. And that, of course, the synagogue was instituted in the intertestamental period. And so that was right after the Old Testament, but right before the New Testament in the intertestamental period. And that is when weekly worship and the idea of the synagogue came about. All right. We mentioned the fact the Sabbath day had a remembrance of God's creation. It also was a remembrance of when God delivered Israel out of the land of Egypt. And of course, that was a pretty big thing. We talked about the Sabbath day not necessarily being Sabbath. We mentioned the fact that it is a traveling holiday. And so at Pentecost, really everything would get changed over. And so if the Sabbath day was Saturday one year, it'd be Sunday the following year, and then it'd be Monday the next year. And it was a traveling holiday. We mentioned the fact that there were not only Sabbath days, but there were also Sabbath years. And every 7 years, all debts were released, all right, and all slaves and servants were released as well, and all debts were forgiven. We mentioned as well that there was a special year called the Year of Jubilee. That was the 50th year. And in that year, all the lands were returned to people, as well as liberty was proclaimed throughout the land. Of course, the Year of Jubilee started on the Day of Atonement. And of course, that has some good meanings to it, all right? We also mentioned the fact that there were different feasts that were held in Israel during Old Testament times. Of course, we had the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that was the feast that happened right after the Passover there, just really dealt with the fact of Israel coming out. We mentioned the Feast of Weeks, and that was kind of their Thanksgiving feast. And then we also mentioned the Feast of Tabernacles, or sometimes it's called the Feast of Booths, and that recounted Israel's traveling through the wilderness. Of course, during these feasts, it was the rejoicing tithe, part of the three types of tithe found in the Old Testament that they would use and they would feast upon. And so it was kind of part of their tithe. We mentioned under the fifth commandment, of course, the idea of honoring one's parents. And of course, a child who cursed or hit his parents could get the death penalty. We also mentioned the idea that a parent would watch over their children, and one of the ways that they watched over their children, especially when they were getting married, was the idea of the dowry. And the dowry was kind of like a wife's insurance policy. Her prospective husband-to-be would give the father of the bride a certain amount of money, usually about 3 years' wages, and that protected the wife just in case the husband did not fulfill his duties as he was supposed to. We also mentioned that a man who took advantage of a virgin in Israel, stole her virginity, would be punished, and one of those punishments was to pay the dowry of virgins, which was 50 shekels of silver. Under the sixth commandment, of course, we mentioned the fact that that commandment kind of is the basis for government, and of course it deals with thou shalt not kill. And along with that, we gave quite a bit of things regarding the death penalty. Of course, in any death penalty case, two witnesses were the minimum amount to give the death penalty. And of course, we mentioned that. Let's see here. I want to make sure I cover everything here. Under this passage, of course, we had our talks about wine, alcoholic wine. And we mentioned Proverbs 31:6 that deals with giving wine to a person who's ready to die and a person who is depressed or heartsick. And of course, we mentioned the fact that we don't believe that is necessarily what it means. Not that we couldn't give alcohol in medicine to a person who's dying, but the idea there was that King Lemuel's mother was saying, you're a king. You're not a dying person. You're not a miserable person. All right, you're a king, and wine is not for kings. And so, was the Bible teaching that we should give depressed people wine? No. All right, obviously that would hurt them. All right. In this passage, also, we talked about the importance of work. Of course, work was not part of the curse of God, and work was something that was given to Adam, and as part of a man's duty in life is to work. And of course, the woman was designed as a helpmeet for man, and man was designed to work. We talked under the seventh commandment. Of course, that deals with marriage law and that sort of thing. We mentioned that there was polygamy in the Bible, although it was definitely not something that God wanted people to do. Oftentimes, polygamy was a result of people wanting an heir, and that is why polygamy often happened in the Bible. We also mentioned there was the law of the Levirate, which dealt with, if a man died without an heir, his brother was to marry his wife and try to raise him up a seed so that his name wouldn't be put out of Israel. And of course, that was kind of a different law that sometimes gets confused. We also mentioned the fact that a husband could not just slander his wife's reputation. And of course, we mentioned that a husband who slandered his wife's reputation as far as morality would be punished. He would also have to pay 100 shekels of silver, and he was not allowed the right to divorce. And so, pretty stiff punishment for that kind of thing. We mentioned the eighth commandment deals with the basis for private property. We talked about lawful ways to get wealth. Of course, a person could get it through labor. They could get it through inheritance. All right. They can get it through gifts. All right. And God was the source of their wealth. All right. In the eighth commandment, of course, we talked about, thou shalt not steal. And of course, we talked about the fact that a thief would have to restore things that he stole. If he was caught in the act, of course, double restitution. Certain things like an ox or a lamb would require fivefold or fourfold restitution based on what it is. We also talked about kidnapping under this section and the fact that slavery was a voluntary thing in Israel. You went into slavery to pay off your debts. If you were guilty of a certain crime and you didn't have the money to pay back, you would work it off. And if a person chose to flee from their master, they could not be compelled to return. However, if they didn't pay back the debt, that would make them an incorrigible criminal, and they could be put to death for that. And so there was an interesting way that God handled that. We also talked about tithing. Of course, in Old Testament times, about 18% of a person's income was tithe, and there were three kinds of tithe: the church tithe, the rejoicing tithe, and the poor tithe. We also mentioned taxes, and of course, in the Old Testament system, there was only a flat tax. That was the only tax, all right? And so very simple half shekel of silver tax. We also mentioned loans, especially in the last lesson. And we said that loans made to, in a sense, believers or to the poor were to be made without usury. And of course, we mentioned usury was interest. Pledges could be taken, and of course, pledges would be collateral. But the pledges, if they dealt with stuff that was necessary for life, had to be returned by sundown. And in some cases, you couldn't take pledges if it basically meant, for instance, their ability to be able to eat. You could not take pledges from, say, widows that were already destitute. And so we mentioned that. We also talked about the justice system. The judges were not allowed to take gifts because that could pollute their ability. All right. Under the essay section as well, we spent quite a bit of time talking about examples of Rahab, the midwives, Moses and Samuel, and we talked about different times in which the Bible seems to indicate it's okay to conceal the truth, and we spent quite a bit of time that. Of course, we mentioned that no enemy or criminal has the right or to knowledge from us that can be used to do us evil. And of course, we spent a lot of time on that. And then we finally got to the 10th commandment. We mentioned the 10th commandment is from the Hebrew word hamad, which has two meanings. The idea of desiring and taking. And that really entails what coveting is. It is desiring something that is somebody else's, that doesn't belong to us. And it's also the attempt to try to take or deceive or by fraudulent means steal something that belongs to somebody else. And we talked about 4 different areas in which a person covets: the house, the wife, the servants, and the oxen, or ass. And of course, that deals with person's station in life, obviously their wife, position, and their possessions. All right. And so that is a very good summary of the different things that are on this test. Of course, definitely know your commandments. Because as I said, there's a matching section, matching all the commandments and the important laws. I think it is will be an easy test for you. You've done very well on all the quizzes, and I think you'll do well as well. Praying for you, and looking forward to Thursday when we'll finish up biblical law.